Welcome to all of you joining us today for this webinar, Marine Cloud Brightening, a Governance Dilemma, which is a GESAMP C2G side event at the UN Oceans Conference. I'm Chris Vivian, co-chair of GESAMP Working Group 41, and I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to GESAMP and C2G. So GESAMP is a joint group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. It's an interagency body of the United Nations established in 1969. And across the bottom there of that slide, you can see the UN agencies that are part of GESAMP, that sponsor GESAMP. I won't go into all the other details of how the body works. I don't think you need to know that at the moment, but you can refer to that later in the recording. And GESAMP Working Group 41 that I co-chair on ocean interventions for climate change mitigation used to be called the Working Group on Marine Geoengineering. And we had a couple of overall objectives when we started in 2015 to better understand the potential environmental and socio-economic impacts of various types of these climate interventions in the ocean, and to provide advice to the London Protocol parties to assist them in identifying those techniques that it might be sensible for listing in the new Annex 4 of the protocol. And we carried out a high-level review of these proposed techniques, which was published in March 2019. You can see on the right there the report, which is available on the GESAMP website. Just a few key points. Since that report, we have some new terms of reference for some key issues that we feel needs to be addressed. And the first one is to develop a framework to integrate inputs from natural sciences and societal disciplines into a holistic assessment of ocean interventions for climate change mitigation. That's a major issue that we're working on currently. Also, to develop a flowchart questionnaire with associated guidance to elicit information from proposers so that we can actually try and sensibly assess them. And the other big issue, providing advice to London Protocol parties to identify, as I said already, those techniques that it might be worth considered for listing, and some other issues that are mentioned there in terms of issues to be addressed in an assessment framework, initial assessment of monitoring, verification, and identifying significant gaps in knowledge and uncertainties. And finally, we also want to stimulate information gathering to fill those widespread knowledge gaps. And finally, quick slide about C2G. The Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative is an independent initiative entirely funded by philanthropy. Its mission is to catalyze governance frameworks for climate altering approaches, in particular for large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. And C2G is impartial on the potential use or non-use of any of those approaches or techniques. And there, I'll hand it over to Miranda now, I think.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Butcher. I'm also a member of the GESAMP Working Group 41 that Chris just told you a little bit about. And I have the pleasure of moderating the discussions today. So as you know, we're here to discuss marine cloud brightening as a governance dilemma. And the background to this discussion is the growing concern that actions currently being undertaken by the global community are not going to be enough to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And some vulnerable places in the world are already experiencing impacts. For example, the Great Barrier Reef has been severely damaged by several marine heat waves recently. And to reduce the heat stress to the reef, a group of Australian researchers and engineers are conducting outdoor experiments on marine cloud brightening by seeking to whiten clouds over the ocean and thus reflect solar radiation back into space. And as you probably know, marine cloud brightening is one type of a range of approaches called solar radiation modification, or SRM, that may have the potential to protect the environment from the risks of a warming climate, but could in turn create novel risks and governance challenges. And these can include concerns that research into solar radiation modification approaches to deal with the effects of climate change might distract the world from dealing with the cause of climate change by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But at the same time, scientists, policymakers, and societies across the world do not know enough about the potential risks and benefits of marine cloud brightening and other types of solar radiation modification approaches that they need to know to be able to make well-informed decisions about their use. And so research is really needed to fill these knowledge gaps. And of course, this raises lots of challenging questions. how do we weigh up the risk of doing research against the risk of not knowing whether or not marine cloud brightening and other solar radiation modification approaches might be a useful climate response options. And what can society learn from the Australian Marine Cloud Brightening Project about the governance of SRM research? And so this event brings together 5 panelists with different backgrounds to share their insights on these challenging questions. And today we'll start with introductions from the panelists and some brief inputs by them on why they're interested in this topic. And then I have some questions for each of them. And after that, we'll move into a question and answer session with the audience before we have some closing remarks by János Pastor, Executive Director of C2G. If you, members of the audience, have questions for the panelists during the discussions, please add them to the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and we will take them up during the question and answer session. So now I would like to invite each of our panelists to briefly introduce yourselves and tell us why you're interested in this topic. Very briefly, maximum 2 minutes, please. Daniel, if you could start, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. My name's Dr. Daniel Harrison, and I'm a biological oceanographer at Southern Cross University here in Australia. And my background is in engineering and then a PhD in science. So I have a focus in my research on looking at the technical side of ocean-based solutions to various problems that humans have created in the oceans and in the climate system. Our ecosystems in the ocean are under more stress now than they have been since humans first started walking on the planet. And so I feel that we have a duty to try and help those ecosystems to prosper under the new world that we've created for them to live in. I lead the cooling and shading sub-program of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation program here in Australia. And our program is focused on finding additional management interventions that we can use beyond those sort of traditional conservation management options that have been applied to the reef so far. And so these novel interventions that we're looking at cover a whole gambit of things, but amongst them is marine cloud brightening. And I'm interested in this technology because as we've modeled all of the different interventions that we're looking at to help the reef, cloud brightening, should it work in as we sort of under a more optimistic type scenario of expecting that it could work within the sort of bounds of what we understand at the moment, which is a lot of uncertainty around that. But should it work, the modeling shows that it's one of the most promising interventions to sort of preserve the reef as we know it, as opposed to try to replace corals, for example, with hardier species.
Great, thanks very much, Daniel. Then we'd move to Phil.
Hello, good morning. My name is Phil Williamson. I'm based at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK, where I'm an honorary reader. For most of my working professional life, I've been working with the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, the funding body, and I've been involved in coordinating and planning and helping to implement projects without actually doing the research myself. But my link with the ocean interventions started about 30 years ago with the first ocean fertilization experiments for iron addition that were carried out by UK scientists and US researchers as well in the Southern Ocean. And since then, I've been involved with a SOLAS international program that reviewed the success or failures of ocean fertilization as far as we know it for the science aspects of it. How successful was it in getting carbon down into deeper waters? And that expanded and developed into interest into ocean interventions more generally, with work for the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD. And we did a first report in 2012 on climate geoengineering in general, about its sort of scientific effectiveness, but also its political feasibility. And I then did a second report for the CBD in 2016, and have also followed up with other reviews and assessments, including for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, involvement in a review for the ocean cryosphere and climate change assessment of a few years ago. So I've broadened in scope, but most of my background has been biological, but also interest in the ocean interventions more generally.
Thanks very much, Phil. And then we would move to Ishita.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ishita Yadav, and I'm from Bangalore, India. I currently serve as South Asia's regional focal point on SDG 7 at the United Nations Major Group for Youth and Children. And I coordinate the cities working group of Youngo, which is the youth constituency to the UNFCCC. And for the past 5 years, I've been bolstering meaningful youth engagement in the multilateral climate governance sphere by elevating youth voices at high-level negotiations and leading community organizing projects around climate mitigation. As an environmental journalist at One Earth, I specialize in highlighting unheard rural climate solutions. And in fact, it was here where my engagement in geoengineering began. It was during my Climate Solutions Journalism Fellowship, where my colleagues and I worked on a solar radiation modification project, particularly exploring issues around its governance. Since then, I've been helping to expand the global conversation around SRM in whatever way I can. I've ran informal workshops at the SDG 7 youth constituency and also here in Bangalore. And beyond youth engagement, I've also been voicing my ideas on SRM as a youth member on the International Renewable Energy Agency's Global Council on SDG 7. And yeah, I think SRM has so much potential, and for the world to be better placed in 2050 or 2040 to take the relevant action, discussions on research and governance needs to be well underway in 2022, and young people need to be meaningfully engaged in every step of the way, especially young people from marginalized groups, young people living in rural and remote areas who often find themselves facing multiple barriers in engaging in policies which in fact affect them the most. I believe that these groups need to be engaged in order to develop sustainable, just, and inclusive climate governance. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Simone.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Very quickly, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a legal professional. I'm an academic at the University of Malta. I've been working in international environmental law for 31 years and with particular specialization on climate issues, and more recently on the climate-ocean nexus. It has always been my passion to work with scientists and with engineers and with other professions in the multidisciplinary fora to bridge the relationship between science and scientific reports and policy and law. That has always been my major role, even as an advisor to my government. I appear here today, however, in my personal capacity, and I'm very interested to find how one can pave the way for governance of this issue, because in reality, there is no governance, there is no law that is regulating this issue. And I think that is the most dangerous position of all, because when something is not regulated, it can lend itself to abuse. Obviously, there are many dilemmas which we will hear about today, and this is the way to address them, by having an open, objective dialogue from a multidisciplinary one to understand better the implications and how these can be addressed. I think it is high time that this dialogue starts, and I will look very forward to what the other panelists and the other members, the other participants have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but definitely not least, Jan.
Thanks, everybody. Hello, welcome to the discussion, and thanks for having me. My name's Jan Mcdonald. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of Lutruwita, Tasmania, which is Australia's southern island state. And I pay my respects to the Palawa people of Tasmania who continue to care for this beautiful land and sea country that I'm lucky enough to call home. I'm a professor of environmental and climate law at the University of Tasmania. I have a particular interest in the governance, the domestic governance of climate adaptation and novel climate interventions. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion with Simone, because from my perspective, there's plenty of governance. It's just not necessarily at the international level. I'm currently leading a project funded by the Australian Research Council that's examining how national laws and national frameworks can be used as a platform for the governance of solar radiation management, research and development, not at the deployment stage. And as part of that project, we're obviously looking at what lessons can be learnt from Australia's national experience with marine cloud brightening. So that's my particular interest tonight.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to move into the questions that I have for you before we open it up for audience questions. So Phil, if we could start with you. You mentioned you were involved in the development of the CBD stance on deliberate climate interventions, which includes marine cloud brightening. Could you give us an insight on how the CBD decision on geoengineering is relevant for these types of marine cloud brightening experiments?
Thank you very much. The CBD looked into all forms of geoengineering, but it was stimulated by ocean fertilization. But they passed resolutions that and arguably are not absolutely binding, but they are certainly very strong guidance that countries should not engage in geoengineering research unless it's at a very low scale, unless it's very regulated. And they did sort of pass some of the responsibility for the marine side to the London Convention, London Protocol for the regulation of marine issues. And Chris Vivian is more expert on that, and for the GESAMP review is fleshing out what the advice and developments might be. But overall, the CBD position was quite clear that the countries of the world that were signatories to and parties to the CBD did not like the idea of geoengineering, did not wish to see geoengineering develop as a response to climate, and certainly the more technological interventions were considered to be risky, they were considered to be unfair, they were considered to be sort of ignoring the problem in the sense of not tackling the root cause. Now, I think 10 years ago, the choice was far more to say, should we reduce emissions or should we carry out geoengineering? Now the realization is that we've got to do both, but we don't call geoengineering. Geoengineering is the sort of the word that's faded away a little bit because of the carbon dioxide removal side of things. It can cover such a wide spectrum, from forest planting to natural solutions. And the question is, well, is that still geoengineering if it's a natural solution? Now, it's not an easy break to make, but whereas planting trees on land is seen generally regarded as not geoengineering and a good thing, but for encouraging plant growth in the ocean through ocean fertilization, that is considered geoengineering. And marine cloud brightening is clearly a physical change to the climate. The issue, I think, that comes out in the international discussions most strongly is what is a sort of national worry and responsibility and what's an international one. Where is the dividing line between impacts that affect just the place where the intervention is carried out and where the intervention affects the wider world? And if the intervention affects the wider world, then the wider world ought to have a say in whether it goes ahead or not, because there will be some countries, some peoples who might have disadvantage and might suffer from that. Now, for marine cloud brightening, overall, from a global perspective, yes, it might reduce, or it's expected to reduce global temperatures, but it will also change weather patterns. And that's, in a sense, what it's intended to do, because if you alter the cloud brightness in one part of the ocean, then you'll alter the weather patterns, you'll alter the climate. This has implications that might be overall beneficial, but there will also be some downsides. This is really sort of the nub of the governance issue, the scale, the impacts, not just the local community, but the world as a whole.
Thank you very much, Phil. Already bringing up some really important issues there about scale and levels of governance that might be relevant for these types of activities. I'm going to Simona now. What do you see as the key issues of solar radiation modification and its governance? What key information do you think is still missing that is needed to make decisions on whether these types of approaches should be researched and or deployed?
So to continue upon what Philip was saying, in fact, perhaps the biggest concern, I believe, and the lack of enthusiasm to debate the issue lies in the fear that this will take us back to the option which Philip referred to, that we, instead of tackling the source of the harm, that is the green phasing out fossil fuels, which are the source of harm that are causing climate change induced by humans, we would have this other option as an easy way out. I think that is the biggest concern that many states have, especially those that have worked so hard to push for the Paris Agreement and who are continuing to work so hard for the green transition, to increase ambition and really accelerate climate neutrality. I think that is the primary issue of concern. Having said that, the fact that the IPCC itself has highlighted that it could possibly be required, or actually they actually recommended that it would be required to have some form of modification, human-induced modification, as opposed to nature-based solutions, which the climate regime proposes. That in itself already shows that there is a lot of information, scientific information, that the temperature offshoot is a reality. And there could be needed some form of supplementary help to all the efforts made by humans, even if we're going to reach carbon neutrality or climate neutrality by mid-century, which is the Paris Agreement's target. Even if we manage to accelerate that, which we are not doing at the moment, we know that some states are still procrastinating and saying they will reach climate neutrality after 2050, which is definitely not not good news. Then we need something to help us in accelerating the process. But this, I think, needs to be made clear that any form of activity in this sense would need to be supplementary to all possible ambition, accelerated ambition to reach climate neutrality as soon as possible. Having said that, there are other issues. The other issues would be the scale of risk, particularly. What would it entail? How would other countries be affected? How would the effects, would there be any cross-border effects, for instance? Can human beings actually specifically control the type of modification that we're talking about? This is all related to a legal principle found in environmental law, which is the precautionary principle. That is, that unless one can prove that risk is minimal and can be in some way controlled, one cannot go ahead and carry out any activities that might cause harm beyond national borders, affecting other countries, affecting areas that are not subject to any jurisdiction. Obviously, countries can and have the sovereignty to exercise any form of activity they consider that could fall within their environmental policy, and perhaps it is easier to control the effects of such experiments in a national level, where the experiments can be more contained and one can study the effects. And this is the kind of perhaps information that is needed. What is research telling us if Australia is carrying out these activities? What are the kind of outputs and what are the results that they are observing, and how can these be controlled? Is there a possibility of controlling them? I think this is the major concern, another major concern. And then the other points would be what about accessibility? If this kind of research and in reality such modification would be beneficial, is it available to all states, or is it only the industrialized and the higher income states that have access to such research and to such experiments for modification, or would this be available to all? And on whose behalf would these experiments be carried out? Would all states be represented? Would all states have a voice in ensuring that they will not be suffering from negative effects, while some other countries will enjoy the benefits? Would other states suffer the consequences? To what extent would they be in a position to voice their concerns and to actually ensure that their interests are protected? I think these are the legal arguments that one has to understand that are very crucial to allowing and regulating and governing solar radiation modification. Even because, and I think one of the biggest dilemmas is that, which is closely related to even to climate change and loss and damage issues, because while we know that human-induced climate change is causing a number of deleterious effects, we are not able to point out the direct causal effect between what one state is doing and the effect suffered by other states elsewhere on the globe. So the inability to trace this direct link is in itself a dilemma, because one cannot measure exactly, one cannot trace the liability, the kind of legal responsibility from the actor to the victim, so as to say. I think I can stop here at this stage, and I conclude by underlining that having states like Australia carrying out this research and the observations that come out of these research programs at the national level will be definitely very helpful to, you know, fuel the debate and give it more information, the required information that is needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Simona, and that's a really good segue into asking Daniel to give us a little bit more information about the marine cloud brightening experiments in Australia. What are the key developments and challenges that you're facing?
Thank you. So I think maybe the most useful thing for me to do is to start off maybe describing the idea of marine cloud brightening for the reef and how it actually differs from the idea of using marine cloud brightening in a geoengineering sense. So the original definition of geoengineering was action with the intent to change the global climate. So to try and counteract the effects of global warming by either reducing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide removal techniques, or by attempting to cool the planet back down and offset the greenhouse gas effect. Although the technology is similar, the marine cloud brightening is the process of trying to brighten clouds, which you might be able to use for either perhaps. The idea to use it on the reef is very fundamentally different than using it in a global sense. In the Great Barrier Reef, the marine cloud brightening that we're considering would be applied intermittently, so only in years where there was a marine heat wave creating bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, and then only over the period of the summertime when the reef and the corals are at risk of bleaching damage. So we're talking about a similar technology, but applied just for a short amount of time as a responsive action to a marine heat wave in this case. I guess the other important difference is even the entire area of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is about 0.07% of the Earth's surface area, so less than 0.1% of the globe. And so because of these, the risks and the potential benefits of doing cloud brightening over the reef are very fundamentally different than trying to do marine cloud brightening to cool the planet. If you were to try and do that, you'd need to obviously apply technology over much larger areas of the oceans. You'd probably choose those areas where it worked best, where there are persistent marine stratocumulus cloud decks. We don't necessarily have those over all of the Great Barrier Reef, but over the Great Barrier Reef, we need cloud brightening to work just well enough to alter the outcome of the corals, so to lower the stress on the corals enough that the mortality is lowered and that the ecosystem can survive. And so when we've done modeling of the Great Barrier Reef and put marine cloud brightening into the models, one of the really interesting things that we've found is that it only works under Paris-type climate change scenario. So from our point of view, there's absolutely no argument as to whether you could do cloud brightening and save the reef and keep emitting greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. It doesn't work. The marine cloud brightening helps a little bit, buys the reef an extra decade or two, but there's only the fundamental science that there's only a limited response of the clouds, which is why it only works under very certain circumstances. Often the clouds are as bright as they can be. But under certain circumstances, which we think occur often over the reef, they're not as bright as they could be, but there's a limited amount that you can brighten them. And even within that limited amount, it's a law of diminishing returns. So for the first extra concentration of aerosols of sea salt crystals that you add for the cloud droplets to nucleate on, you get the maximum response, and it diminishes exponentially after that. So what this means is that basically it's essential that we have both the strongest possible action on climate change in conjunction with the marine cloud brightening maybe helps the reef. In terms of the challenges, they're also related to this, I think. I'd spend a lot more than the time available if I was to talk about all of them, but perhaps one of the most pertinent ones to this conversation is just scaling up the technology, should it even be possible, to the area of the reef is easily our biggest challenge. It's going to be immensely difficult. At the moment, the power requirements are very large, so doing it with renewable energy is difficult. And at the moment, it's very, very difficult for me to see how you could ever scale this technology to be globally relevant. That's not to say that there couldn't, of course, be some kind of breakthrough in the future that makes it possible. But at the moment, that looks exceptionally unlikely to me. I think our biggest challenge will be scaling it to make it work well enough over the reef. I'll just go one more challenge and call it there. But I think the next fundamental challenge for us is just the huge level of uncertainty. So we've designed quite a large research program that covers, of course, the technology itself, but also the risks, the social aspects. We have a large social science component in our project, surveying the general Australian population, as well as stakeholders and traditional owner groups with a more direct interest in the reef. We're looking at the risks, we're looking at the benefits, we're looking at how much it might cost to roll out this technology. We're looking at how to try and power it with renewable energy. And across all of those things, they all have extremely high levels of uncertainty. So I think our other challenge is just how very, very early in this whole path that we might be in terms of even understanding the technology and understanding the fundamental cloud microphysical processes as well. And so I think, I guess my point would be that I think it's hard to do a good job in governing something that you don't understand the potential benefits and the potential risks. And so the research is key in improving our understanding.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Yeah, and I think we'll go to Jan now, because she has indicated she sees some potential for regional, national, or even subnational legal instruments in filling, what might be an international governance gap for these types of research and deployment activities. Jan, could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not sure that I even see that there's an international governance gap in respect of marine cloud brightening as I think of it and as Daniel's talking about it, because at the moment, I think it is actually more appropriately conceptualized as an adaptation action rather than squarely in the camp of solar radiation management. And I think it's worth reminding the audience that the recent calls for a non-use agreement on solar radiation management techniques specifically acknowledge that it doesn't apply to these local level actions, and they particularly name up marine cloud brightening as an example of the kind of adaptation response that would fall outside the scope of a non-use agreement. I should point out that we think about international law as governing in a way that inhibits the use of these kinds of technologies. But it is worth pointing out that one of the key drivers for the MCB program in Australia is, of course, the looming prospect of the Great Barrier Reef being placed on the World Heritage in Danger list under the World Heritage Convention, and Australia's very onerous obligations for protection of the reef under that convention. So there are elements of international law that you might actually think about as being facilitative or supportive of this kind of R&D. And you could even argue that the FCCC's expectation that we try to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change, I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is an alternative to mitigation, but there are important elements of the international regime that speak to support for these kinds of initiatives. In terms of Australia's framework, though, what I think we have in place, and Daniel will probably speak to this, I think, with more first-hand experience, is a framework governance regime that I think provides a really important platform for other countries to consider. It provides an opportunity for Australia to export its experience to other coral reef countries, at least, bearing in mind that that's the focus here at the moment. What we've done with the framework is take what's already a very sophisticated governance regime related specifically to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, where it has its own specialist agency. It has a very sophisticated zoning regime. There's policies governing all sorts of activities that can be conducted on the reef, including bespoke research governance frameworks. And on top of that has been implemented this policy specifically speaking to these proactive interventions. And what's interesting about that interventions policy is that it works from the premise that interventions are necessary and that they are going to be essentially the only thing that can sustain the resilience of the reef until we manage to stabilise temperatures. So it's an interesting problem framing, if you like, in that respect. And so the interventions policy takes this, risk-based approach where there are some types of intervention that are considered to be just too high risk and will not be considered. But this kind of intervention doesn't fall into that category. They're talking there about, genetic modification of coral species, for example, but marine cloud brightening falls within that sort of medium level of risk where these incremental stepwise or stepped change progressive experiments are going to be contemplated, where each time you make an assessment of what's been learned, what the issues are. I won't go into more detail because I think Daniel will talk more about it, but I'd be really happy to talk more about where I see the deficiencies in that regime. But I think that Australia has got a very good starting point. It ticks nearly all of the boxes for any one of the codes of practice for research governing solar radiation management, whether it's the Asilomar principles or the Oxford principles, or any of the other ones that various SRM scholars have looked at. We've done some comparisons of how the regime stacks up here, and we think it's actually performing quite well. It's not perfect. There are some issues that I'd like to see improved, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it that doesn't start with the premise that we need international governance first.
Thank you very much, Jen. A lot to dig into there. I'd like to go now to Ishita and ask her, what role do you think young people such as yourself can and should play in discussions and decisions about whether to test or use marine cloud brightening and potentially other SRM approaches in the future?
Thank you. So I think youth involvement and leadership in geoengineering efforts are vital to achieving long-standing positive results. Over the next decade, young people will directly influence the outcome of SDG 13 as a key driver for its successful implementation. Youth empowerment and engagement facilitates a paradigm for change, fostering innovation, advancing sustainable leadership, and promoting equality. Unfortunately, young people are not only disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, but are often excluded from policy and decision-making processes, despite their active involvement in their communities and very strong commitment to advancing Agenda 2030. I think this highlights the need to create enabling environments for young people to engage in policymaking frameworks as empowering young people from diverse backgrounds to engage in decision-making processes around frameworks such as marine cloud brightening and other solar radiation modification. Approaches can have profound holistic benefits on governance structures. Governance frameworks developed now will be anticipatory and adaptable to circumstances in the future. And as the different scenarios of SRM play out, who better to understand the problems that may lie tomorrow than the individuals who will be there tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow. I think if young people can be involved in a meaningful participatory process, sky's the limit. Young people bring fresh and creative energy. Youth are at the forefront of innovation. They're developing new technologies. They have starting their own startups and in so many sectors, from clean energy to waste management to transportation. And SRM is so interdisciplinary. We never know what technology from what sphere can come in and kind of mitigate the risks or scale up some of the ideas that we have now. And I think young people have, proven to be one of the most resilient in the face of change. And I think that we can contribute in ways that most stakeholders can't imagine, both technically and socially. But this will only happen if they're empowered with quality education and training, finance, and meaningful employment opportunities in the geoengineering sphere, which is gradually growing. But as new opportunities come up, I'm sure that young people will be given the opportunity to contribute. And young people, time and time again, they've participated and contributed and catalyzed some really important changes in our political system and power sharing dynamics, which I think is a very key issue around SRM, is how to make sure that the power is fairly distributed. And because some nations will clearly benefit more than others, young people can actually be a key player in ensuring that the power is fairly distributed. And in this digital era, young people may be more open-minded, tolerant, and even more socially aware than some of the other stakeholders at the table. As one of the most proactive group of young people have demonstrated their proficiency in engaging with diverse groups of stakeholders, from academia and governance to indigenous communities and research groups, really helping consolidate their views. And I think if given the opportunity, young people can serve as a bridge. They can be the common factor, like every community, whether that's indigenous, whether that's developing nations, whether that's the most developed nations, they all have youth and they're all striving to empower them. So this can actually be like a common factor, especially in terms of any barriers faced in international governments. Young people can really bridge the stakeholders, and they can play a very central role in shaping a inclusive governance process, which I think is one of the core issues around SRM. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I have a lot of further follow-up questions on what's already been said, but we do also want to give our audience a chance to ask questions. So I'd invite all the audience members to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll address them to the panelists. I'd also like to invite Chris, Vivian, and János Pastor to turn their cameras on at this point, so they can also join in answering questions if need be. We've already got a couple of questions in the chat. One from David Santillo that asks, given the relatively hands-off approach the authorities in Australia appear to have shown so far to the whale-X ocean fertilization studies, even where there are existing resolutions in place that would have allowed detailed assessment, consultation, and decision-making, what level of confidence can we have that there will be effective levels of governance and regulation in Australia in relation to marine cloud brightening? And I think I would ask Jan and Daniel to speak to this.
Do you want to go first, Daniel?
Sure.
Yeah.
So look, I can't speak to whale-X and whatever they might be doing, of course, but I think this is a good opportunity to, the last part of that question is how can we be confident about the marine cloud brightening project, and that I can answer quite confidently. So, and maybe I'll take the opportunity to talk a little bit about our governance structure. So I guess it starts, and I'll try to talk less about this and leave it for Jan, but the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, within which all of our, or under the jurisdiction of which all of our research takes place, is one of the best managed marine parks in the world. It's a federal agency that, as Jan mentioned before, has extremely specific risk assessment frameworks. So no research can be done in the marine park, even completely passive research, for example, just taking out an air quality sensor that creates no impact whatsoever, still needs to go through the entire Great Barrier Reef Marine Park assessment process. So that's one part, that's the federal legislation, and there's more that sits above that, but in the interest of time, I'll leave that for Jan. But within our program, just to give you a sense of the governance under which this research is taking place, we have a board that's made up of a member, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research of each of the universities involved, and a representative from the 2 Australian federal government organisations involved, AIMS and the CSIRO. That board also has a traditional owner representative and 2 completely independent board members. Under the board sits a steering committee, again made up of a variety of representatives, including independents and both male and female traditional owner representatives on that board. Sitting with the board and the steering committee, we have a traditional owner advisory panel made up of Indigenous representatives. We have a risk subcommittee that specifically looks at the risks of interventions and specifically evaluates the research proposals, not just for marine cloud brightening, but for all of the research within the project, especially when it comes to field work, obviously, when there's a risk to the environment. Then even separate to that, we have a fully independent risk review panel to then independently from the program itself review risks associated with the research. And then finally, within our program, we're actually ourselves conducting research, of course, into the risks of all of the various interventions that might be applied to the Great Barrier Reef. Part of our research goals are, of course, not just to understand the potential benefits, but to understand the potential risks, both expected and unexpected. And then just going back to something that was mentioned before, in terms of sort of disseminating the learnings, the intellectual property developed within our program, the ownership of that intellectual property stays with whoever invented it, but they, by participating in the RAP program, they agree to give a worldwide unrestricted license, including the right to relicense, essentially allowing anyone in the world to use the technology that's developed. And then on top of all of that, we have extremely high levels of community engagement. So and traditional owner engagement as well. So I'm excited, you know, week after next, we'll have our first community reference panel that's been set up to look at the interventions. And so that's made up of members of the general community in Northeast Queensland. It was an open call for expression of interest of people that would want to sit on that community reference people. It includes young people, it includes a broad cross section of the local community. And we're of course working very, very closely with traditional owners. So in fact, all of the research that we've conducted in my sub program so far, every field trip has actually involved a traditional owner representative that comes and participates in the research, and we engaging closely with traditional owner groups, you know, not just to bounce ideas off, but to actually co-design the research. Traditional owners have been looking after their sea country on the reef for tens of thousands of years, and their voice needs to really be respected. And because of that, we don't actually do any research whatsoever on the Great Barrier Reef without first having the free, prior and informed consent of the traditional owners of that specific sea country where we are doing the research. So I think I'll try and, I'm not sure how long I've talked, but I'll try and keep it down. So I think hopefully that answers the question. In terms of our project, we really hope that the levels of governance and community engagement and social science that we've put in place around our research, you know, could act as an exemplar to other research groups interested in doing research on similar, I guess, interventionist approaches to deal with some of the impacts of climate change, where where there are so many voices and it is so cross-disciplinary and there are so many different interests and perspectives that need to be taken into account.
Thanks, Daniel. Jan, you want to add to that? And perhaps also in doing so, you could speak to another question that we have. Will a guidebook be developed by Australia which identifies good practice for marine cloud brightening governance?
Well, I think that I understood that the guidebook question was actually more about the technology and what worked and what didn't. And that's definitely in Daniel's wheelhouse. And I'm assuming that there'll be plenty of outcomes from his research as it evolves in the next few years. I did want to, I guess, reflect on that, the assumption that was in the question that had been asked, which was this idea that the Australian government had taken a hands-off approach to WHALEX. And I don't know a lot about the WHALEX experiment, but I am confident that the reason that the first field test had been permitted was because it was for a narrow research purpose within the meaning of the London Protocol, and therefore didn't require approvals under Australia's sea dumping legislation. But my understanding is that they've made it very clear that if there's any scale up of that activity, even for research, they'll probably need to get a permit in Australia. And so I'm not sure that I agree with the premise that the Australian government took a hands-off approach to that. And I'm not saying that it did or didn't, I'm just not sure. But I don't think that the two are comparable. There's some overlap between the relevant agencies, but as Daniel's said, and as I was making the point before, the activity on the Great Barrier Reef is principally governed by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which is established under its own statutory regime, and it has very clear statutory responsibilities. It is expected to manage the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park for a whole range of uses, but none of those uses can undermine its management for conservation. It's its number one purpose. And so the whole of the Reef Blueprint for Resilience and the planning over the next sort of 30 years for the reef is all about ensuring that it remains as capable of withstanding climate shocks as we can possibly make it. And it's also really worth reminding the audience that the shading program, as Daniel said, is only one part of this comprehensive RRAP program. It includes a whole range of other interventions as well, including bringing warm adapted corals, different types of coral farming techniques. So it's a multi-pronged approach, of which the cooling and shading strategies are just a part.
Thank you very much. And we've got more questions for Daniel, but I want to make sure that other people also can get involved in the conversation. So I would like to come back to Ishita and ask her if you, for example, or young people, as Daniel pointed out, young people are being involved in these participatory processes to develop governance of marine cloud brightening. What are some of the hopes and concerns that you think young people will bring or could bring into these discussions?
Yeah, thank you. So I think while young people, like many other communities, don't have a consolidated stance as to for SRM or against SRM, I think we do understand the gravity of our current circumstances and are in favor of research and experimentation of SRM to better understand its short-term and long-term impacts. And to be prepared in the event of a climate emergency, I think now is the time to establish internationally coordinated open SRM research programs, as well as start designing inclusive governance architecture. I think, but one of the main concerns harbored by many of the young people I've engaged with is the lack of inclusivity on current SRM activities. Many developing countries would stand to gain or lose the most if SRM was ever deployed. However, despite this, most of the research and discussion of SRM is taking place in developed, highly industrialized countries. And to make the vision of open and global discussion on SRM a reality, my peers and I hope that solar geoengineering research on a large scale can be independently conducted beyond Europe and North America, and in more like in developing regions, and also empowering these developing regions to run their own consultations on SRM and develop their own stances. This can be funding can be acquired from different sources, but I think the main point is to ensure that these consultations are locally led but globally connected. And that being said, I think another interesting point, which might have been brought up before, is it's important to highlight that in the global discussion on SRM, that these technologies are only a temporary fix. It's a means to buy us some much needed time in the race to net zero. It's a way to offset the detrimental impacts of global warming, which we're not yet equipped to face. But at some point, no amount of SRM deployment will suffice to lower temperatures. And this could potentially cause a massive and rapid surge in global temperatures. And thus, it's so important that SRM doesn't make nations misdirect their attentions from ambitious actions needed to meet the 1.5 degree promise of the Paris Agreement. And I think this is an important idea to explore. However, through my engagement with youth segments, some methods to increase surface albedo seem more popular than others. Methods employing similar concepts to SRM. These include brightening human settlements, introducing more reflective crop varieties, placing large desert reflectors, large-scale afforestation in deserts, large-scale deforestation at high latitudes, and even making oceans brighter with safe chemicals. I think by conducting safe and small-scale SRM experiments, we believe that governments can build the trust and capacity for future geoengineering proposals and activities that may be more radical in nature. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I'd like to come just briefly back to Simona in relation to this question about the potential for mitigation deterrence or moral hazard, the dilemma, the concern that the idea of potentially in the future being able to cool the planet via SRM approaches may lower the perceived need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's considered by some to be a risk of researching, even though these small experiments are not designed to do this. What are your thoughts on this issue and how governance may help to mitigate the risk?
Thank you very much, Miranda. Yes, I in fact go back to what Daniel was saying, that in fact he argued, and this was very good news to hear, that the experiments that are currently being conducted and by Australia would only work if we really continue with our ambition to reduce emissions as much as possible and as soon as possible. So that is already, I think, quite comforting to hear. And we hope that all states have this kind of ethos in their approach, even if they carry out these SRM methodologies in situ on very small scale. With respect to the risk, yes, it is unfortunately human nature that we tend to go for the easier option, the one that doesn't affect our behavioral trends, the one that is least costly in the short term. So this is why it's always considered as a risk in diverting the attention from focusing on climate neutrality, achieving climate neutrality as soon as possible, because obviously a lot of countries, even for social reasons, are finding it very challenging to wean themselves off fossil fuels. So it's that the risk is there. However, what I wished also to add is that in hearing what our Australian colleagues were explaining, clearly one can see that a very, very well-structured governance framework is essential for such experiments, because it evaluates the scale of risk, which we were talking about. It is also evident that there is transparency in the kind of observation results that we get. And what Jan was referring to earlier, that in reality, the international regime does not exclude these experiments as a possible support for adaptation. That is true. And we have the obligation to help ourselves. I mean, that is why science exists. This is why humans delve into research. If these offer a real, just, ethical solution with the kind of observation that we need, without with ensuring the kind that the risks can be managed as much as possible, yes, definitely, this is the way forward, and we need all the help we can get. It's also true, however, that the absence in the international regime is the risk element. When an activity is not specifically prohibited as being harmful, then the chances that a country can carry out such experiments which have repercussions beyond borders would not be regulated, in the sense, would not be excluded. So while the regime itself, even the UNFCCC regime, promotes the possibility of research and any form of enhancement of for adaptation measures, at the same time, there is no specific prohibitory regime like you have, for example, with respect to nuclear testing in outside national jurisdiction. Then obviously that is a cause of alarm and concern, especially for countries that cannot keep up with the research and with the possibility of defending themselves if there are other countries that opt to carry out such experiments without taking all the necessary precautions at the national level, as we have seen and we have heard from our Australian colleagues. I think these are the ethical issues, the dilemmas that I think even Ishita was referring to, if I understood her correctly. Thank you.
Thanks, Simona. And then coming back to a couple of related questions in the chat. One from Ezio Amato. Many thanks to all. Mainly for Daniel, do you think we have enough knowledge on marine ecosystems functioning to be in a condition of measuring, observing, being aware of the most of the unplanned effects of marine cloud brightening or other techniques may have on that particular ecosystem? So this relates to unexpected or unknown side effects that the intervention may have.
So it's obviously very intervention specific, that question. So what we're doing in one whole sub program of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation program is started a selection of monitoring sites, sort of more in-depth ecological and biological monitoring, I think, that's probably ever been undertaken on the reef before. And so they've established these bunch of sites, and they're doing it with that specific design goal in mind, to understand how these different interventions might impact the coral community and the ecology of the coral community, you know, were they to be applied and were they to be scaled up. So that the research is absolutely happening. I'm not an ecologist or a biologist, so I can't answer too much in the details of that. I think in the case of marine cloud brightening, as it's envisioned for the reef, I mean, the effects are the sort of the direct effects as far as the marine ecosystem is concerned are fairly predictable. It's a reduction in incoming solar radiation, change in the albedo of the clouds. And, you know, of course, these changes are very well within the natural variability that we have, you know, between sort of cloudy and uncloudy days, and even cloudy and slightly less cloudy years, right? There's quite a lot of variability, for instance, between a El Nino year and a La Nina year, or even an El Nino year and a neutral year. Quite a lot of difference in the cloud cover, even more than would be sort of achieved by the cloud brightening. And interestingly, the clouds, where some of this research is elucidating just how important the clouds are in the actual bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. We tend to have the bleaching events in those summers where there's less cloud cover, because corals actually bleach from both the warm water and excess light energy. So it doesn't completely answer your question to the highest level of detail, I'm afraid, but there's a part of the program that's looking into that. It's just not my expertise exactly, but we're certainly doing our very best to cover it off.
Thanks, Daniel. And then coming back to the question that I directed to Jan before about a guidebook for good practice, I misread it as a governance good practice, but we could also read it as a good practice for planning and carrying out such experiments. Do you plan to disseminate the lessons learned, and in what fashion? Sorry, Daniel, I think I was directing that question to you. I'm not sure if I didn't make that clear.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said Jan.
I did. I directed it to Jan previously, and she deflected and said, I think it's not about governance good practice, but rather about research good practice. So I'm redirecting it back to you.
Sure. So I haven't heard anybody suggest that we should write a guidebook exactly so far, but it could be an excellent suggestion. But certainly, the entire RAP program, including the governance structure, is designed to be as transparent as we can possibly make it. So if anybody's interested in the governance structure of RAP, I suggest that they have a look at the website. But I think certainly the social science, and actually I should have mentioned, we have a regulatory sub-program as well that's specifically doing similar research to Jan in terms of looking at whether the Australian regulation is fit for practice in managing these very, very novel type ecosystem interventions that we're just beginning to research. And so I imagine that as that team starts to publish their findings, that's probably where you would find the guidance as to how we've set up our program and attempted to do best practice.
Wonderful, thanks very much. And then we have one last question in the chat, which I would use as an opportunity to also hand back over to János Pastor for some final words. The question is, will C2G summarize this information in a paper and make it available? This session has been very interesting. So I'd hand that over to János and also hand over to him at this point for some concluding comments.
Thank you, Miranda. So first to the question, what we are planning is to make available the video, the recording. It will be available on our website. It will take some days, so don't look for it this afternoon. But when we make these videos available, we tend to identify a few clips that are interesting, that highlight the discussion. So that's what we have planned. We have not planned a summary report, but it's something we can consider, and we'll see whether we are able to put that together either ourselves or with the help of others. So that's in terms of the response to the question. And then, so I was asked to say a few words at the end. First of all, thank you to the panelists for coming up with some really interesting ideas about their work. And thank you to the people who have asked questions. I think it was a very rich discussion, and I would need more than 2 minutes to be able to summarize what we heard. But I did hear a couple of very interesting points, and I just want to raise a few. So one of them clearly is that we don't always use the same terminology about the same thing. So let's be clear always about what we're talking about. Whether you use geoengineering or climate altering techniques, that doesn't matter. But let's be clear what we mean, what is defined, what is included in those terminologies. What I also heard very clearly from all of the speakers is that marine cloud brightening is not a solution. It is not a solution, but it can be a supplement at times, as we heard, when it's really needed in certain parts of the world or in certain regions within countries. So then, and that was an interesting discussion from different angles, that we need to embed governance of MCB, of marine cloud brightening, into existing governance frameworks of other issues, link them, connect them. And so let's not try to govern these new emerging techniques in silos, but let's try to deal with them in the context of broader society. And then some of those needs can be done very much at the local level, sometimes at the regional level, and sometimes at the global level, but always connected back into the local level. And I have to say that at the end, that they all have to make sure that the youth are engaged in that process, because they're going to have to live with this stuff for a much longer time than some of us. So these are just a few things that I pulled out. This is by no means a summary. I think it's also clear from, and I wanted to say this at the end, that it was clear from this discussion, but also from other knowledge, that these kinds of issues really need transdisciplinary knowledge, and that's the only way we can make use of these to help with our Paris temperature goals. It's what I hope, and what my colleagues in C2G hope, that this discussion can, that today's event can help to kickstart other discussions, not just those who were day-to-day involved with marine cloud brightening, but a broader set of discussions between different stakeholders who ultimately are working for a better world, both in terms of the environment, the people, and the economy as well. And we do think that the Ocean Conference that is taking place right now, the Ocean Decade, and of course negotiations under UNCLOS, CBD, etc., some of these that were mentioned today, are presenting timely opportunities to address knowledge and some governance gaps of SR. But we also believe that the UN General Assembly may also play an important role in setting the overall context, particularly for those aspects that are global in nature, and to be able to connect the required governance processes between different actors, such as the ocean process, and of course others as well. So with that, thank you very much for everybody's participation, and let's move on and look forward to another one like this at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.